Until the End by Strumfreak. A New Beginning, Part 1. Still shaking, she brought herself to walk over to the knife and picked it up in her mouth before walking back to Lyra's still laying body. She dropped next to her and looked from her to the knife several times before she stopped looking directly at the blade she held between her hooves. "Together till the end," she said before bringing the knife to her throat. Lyra's eyes snapped open with a split second before Bonbon had pulled the blade across her neck. "Bonbon!" she yelled out to her mare friend as fast as she could stop her, but she was too late. Bonbon had drawn the blade across her neck and slashed right through it. But she didn't see any hint of blood, nor change in Bonbon's expression. Instead, something else appeared to happen. Lyra could see the scene around her fading away. Everything in her suddenly vividly clear line of sight began to smudge and fade away as if it wasn't there. She watched as everything in the room disappeared, staring up at her mare friend, who suddenly came to start looking down at her, as she too began to visibly blur in front of Lyra. Lyra was still being cradled by Bonbon, but in her confusion on attempting to move, she found that she was stuck in her position, as if paralyzed. As soon as Lyra focused on her body, though, rather than what was happening around her, she realized that although she couldn't move, she felt no pain. She could remember hardly moments ago when she was choking on blood pooling up in her horribly damaged neck, fighting with her body to let her tell her lover how she felt one last time. Now she felt nothing at all. Her pain was gone, her injuries were gone, and her vision was clear again. Or so she made the assumption, but couldn't be sure while everything around her was fading away. She looked up again at Bonbon, who was starting to fade from Lyra's sight as well as the room. She couldn't tell if she might have been dreaming, but after what she just saw happen, the last thing she wanted was to lose sight of Bonbon. She called out again as everything continued to fade to blackness. "Bonbon, what are you doing? Don't leave me alone!" she cried, feeling clean tears come to her eyes. Although her eyes no longer glowed with redness or looked glazed with water, the tears still stung her. She wanted nothing more than to reach up and pull Bonbon back into her arms and back into form, but she was still restricted of movement. As the room around her faded to blackness completely, she attempted one last time to reach out to Bonbon, but failed yet again. Tears streamed down her face, and she stopped straining her body, closing her eyes so she didn't have to be subjected to the sight of her true love fading from her sight for the last time. Aching and alone, and now believing her heart was being truly broken, she whimpered and spoke again in a faint, stammered voice. "I love you." Bonbon held the knife between her hooves, pressed against her neck, but couldn't bring herself to go any further with what she was thinking. She felt in her mind she had nothing left to live for, but she knew in her heart Lyra would have wanted her to live on and have a happy life. But how could she be happy when the one mare she cared about and loved was gone? She knew no one could bring back the dead, and she wasn't certain of what happened to ponies when they passed away, or where they might end up. But she didn't care. She held hope in her heart that it was a happy place, and if that it was, Lyra would be waiting for her. She tried again to make her final move, but she still lacked the strength to do it. She dropped the knife beside her and cried. Her eyes were bloodshot and stinging more than ever before. She'd been upset when her previous Special Sun ponies had broken up with her, but Lyra wasn't just another simple partner. She hung her head down and rested it on Lyra's. Her tears dribbled down her cheeks and onto Lyra's face before dripping into the floor and joining the blood on the floor. "I'm so sorry, Lyra. I'm so sorry," she whimpered, cradling her head and wishing that she could have returned earlier or never left to start with. She sniffled and tried to think about what might have happened had she been faster, returned earlier, or just forgiven Lyra and stayed by her side. She could see so many happy outcomes and saw them together again in each of them, but felt her heart grow colder and more shallow each time she looked back at her dead partner and felt reality clawing at her emotions. Lyra was gone, and no matter which way she looked at it, she would always be gone. Bonbon felt her muscles go weak, causing her to collapse and do nothing but lay on Lyra's lifeless body. Thoughts flashed through her mind of her family and Lyra's family. Both their parents were gone too. She wondered if maybe Lyra had found them and was waiting for her with them, but the thought brought her no comfort. It just made her think about loss again and how she felt when her mother died. She coughed as more tears poured out of her eyes, thinking about how Lyra had been there to comfort her, while no pony else had showed her any sense of decency or care. Lyra stayed with her the whole night and just let her cuddle her and cry on her shoulder until she fell asleep. Every night for a week she had done the same thing, even joining her in crying at some point when seeing her friend heartbroken had become too much for her to handle. She'd never really felt the same way about her father. She'd always been upset that she couldn't have been old enough to remember him before he died, but she didn't have enough of an emotional attachment that it hurt to think about him. When she thought about all the times Lyra had been there for her in her life, she also remembered the times she had done the same thing. Lyra had never shown that she had been close with her parents, but when her mother was diagnosed with cancer, she'd never remembered seeing her more upset. Lyra had spent almost every night crying in her arms, afraid to go home in case she found her mother had passed away. And when she wasn't by her side, when she did pass away, she had blamed herself for weeks. Bonbon cried at some more as she remembered having talked Lyra out of suicide at one of the worst points in her life. It was beginning to get late as Bonbon walked Lyra home from her own house. Her chest and shoulders were wet with Lyra's tears, and her own eyes were watering to see her friend in this condition. Today had marked the 22nd day since Lyra's mother was diagnosed with cancer. She remained at home as it was untreatable and was unwilling to die in a hospital bed if nothing could be done. Lyra continued to sob, finding it hard to walk when her legs felt so weak. Bonbon wanted to say something comforting, but she was almost lost for words. She wanted to reassure Lyra everything would be okay, but they both knew the truth too well. Her mother had only been growing worse, and she wouldn't last much longer. Can I please just stay at your house? I don't want to go home, Lyra stammered as she saw her home in the distance. I would let you, Lyra. I truly would. But your mum needs you. I'll stay with you, but you really need to be there for her, Bonbon replied, disheartened that she couldn't follow through her friend's request without feeling a negative impact on her conscience. I know, but what if something does happen? I don't know what I'll do. I'll be too scared. And Dad isn't comforting either. He hasn't even said a word to me since he was told about Mum. He just sits by her side and doesn't move, Lyra said, feeling more tears trickling down her cheeks. Bonbon sighed. I'll be there for you, Lyra. If anything happens, I'll always make sure I do everything I can to help you, she told her, trying to at least show she would be there if she needed her. Thank you, Bonbon, Lyra replied gratefully, hardly able to offer a weak smile though. The pair approached her house, and Bonbon held the door open for her as Lyra walked inside. She shut the door and started to make her way to the lounge room, while Lyra made her way to her room first to drop off her saddlebag. Bonbon thought about Lyra and the pain she must have been going through to see her mum in the condition she was in. Expecting to see Lyra's father sitting next to her mother, she opened the door to the lounge room. Her eyes flashed over to the mare lying on her chair, but Lyra's father was nowhere to be seen. She surveyed the room quickly and looked back at Lyra's mother before a sudden look of horror descended upon her face. She was completely still. Oh no, she said in a weak whisper. She ran over to the mare and held her ear next to her snout. No sign of breathing at all. She lay her head on her chest to check for a heartbeat, but there was nothing. All she could feel was the cold body of the dead mare. No, she can't be gone, Bonbon said to herself, panicking and feeling tears welling up in her eyes. Why? Why now? She asked, as if expecting someone to answer. Why now what? She heard asked from across the room. She turned her head to see Lyra standing at the door. Lyra looked at Bonbon's expression, and upon seeing the tears in her eyes, her expression further descended, before her eyes rested on her mother. "Mum?" she asked from the room, tears filling her eyes before she started to struggle forwards. "Lyra, she's..." Bonbon tried to say something, anything, but nothing other than mumbling came out. "Mum?" Lyra stuttered again, struggling to move any closer as her legs became heavy, as if they were being held down by weights. She pushed through it and stopped by her mother's side and looked down at her. She was peaceful and still, but the sight crushed Lyra's heart. Lyra couldn't even finish the word anymore, her eyes flooding with tears as she was about to collapse under her emotions. "Lyra, I'm so sorry," Bonbon said, letting her tears crash to the floor. She wanted to hide the sight to stop Lyra's pain, but there was nothing she could do now. Bonbon felt her body going cold. Her stomach felt as though it was rolling over inside her, and her heartbeats were growing heavy and slow. Lyra wanted to call out to her mother, but it was no use. She was gone, and so was her voice. Lyra didn't want to do anything anymore, and she just cried. Bonbon managed to step closer, but as she reached forward, Lyra collapsed to the floor. She lay there in her pool in tears, her heart in agony and sickness stirring in her stomach. Every second she could see her mother, the feeling became worse. Bonbon knew she had to get Lyra out of the room. The sight of seeing someone important in your life die is hard enough, but seeing her own mother lifeless in front of her eyes was killing Lyra, and she knew it. Bonbon nudged Lyra's shoulder, and as bad as she felt, she was intent on getting her out of the room. "Lyra, you shouldn't have to see this. You should lay down," she said, continuing to cry at the sight of her friend in her state. "Stay with me tonight, please," Lyra stammered, as if begging for company. She would have had anyway. Of course I will," Bonbon replied before leaning down and sliding Lyra's arm over her shoulder and gently lifting her to her hooves. "You've seen too much tonight. If you stay any longer, you'll hurt yourself more," Bonbon told her, stuttering and struggling to have to do this. Lyra just cried, barely able to walk a step even with Bonbon's support. Do you think... Do you... Lyra tried to ask Bonbon something, but she was having far too much trouble. They passed the door to the room, and about halfway to Lyra's room, she tried again. "Do you think that she died happy?" Lyra asked. Bonbon had to be reassuring, and while there was no smile on her face, she knew that Lyra's mother didn't have any regrets. "Knowing she had a daughter as amazing as you, she would have been happy even through her last breath," Bonbon said, bringing more tears to both their own eyes. But knowing she'd made a tiny positive impact in Lyra's mind, as she opened the door to Lyra's room, she gently laid her down on the bed. "I'll be right back. I need to make sure someone else knows about this," she said, standing at the door but getting no reply. Bonbon sighed and walked back down the hallway. She looked into the room again at the mare on her deathbed and felt more tears pour from her eyes. She reached up to close the door, but noticed something she hadn't seen before, and under the mare's pillow. Bonbon entered the room and looked down at what appeared to be the edge of a letter. She pulled it out and sat beside the couch to read it. "My dearest daughter Lyra, I know my time is coming soon, and I won't be around much longer. But if when I go you aren't here, I want you to know I love you. I love you so much. Having been blessed with a beautiful daughter like you has given me a reason to treasure the life I have lived. And while I will not see much more of yours, I want you to know that I am proud of you. You've grown into a beautiful and wonderful young mare, and I know that you will continue to improve, and that if I were there, I would only continue to grow more proud of you. Remember that my love for you will never die, and that until I see you again, I will always be with you in your heart. I love you, Lyra, your mother." symphony. Bonbon felt her heart beating heavy in her chest, and her tears were drowning the carpet below her in water. She'd never read anything so touching and heartfelt in her life. She picked it up in her mouth, being as careful as she could to make sure she didn't get her tears on it. She made her way back to Lyra's room, intent on showing her the letter to cheer her up, but found Lyra crying and looking at a picture of her and her mother and father. She put the letter in her saddlebag next to Lyra's and decided that after everything she'd been through tonight, it'd be best to wait till the morning. Bonbon walked over to Lyra's bed and laid down next to her, while Lyra put the picture under her pillow. "I wonder where he went," Lyra contemplated, referring to her father. She let out a sigh, moving closer to Bonbon and nuzzling herself into her chest. "Thank you for being here for me, Bonbon. You're an amazing friend," Lyra stuttered. "I'll always be here for you, Lyra," she replied before lying in silence and letting Lyra cry herself to sleep on her chest. Lyra kept her eyes closed. She didn't want to open them anymore. She could tell there was nothing for her to look at. Although she felt control of her limbs return, she stayed curled up on the ground, feeling weak and pathetic. She had come to terms that she was now dead, but she regretted the decision she had made and wanted more than anything to take it back. She had never been a strong-hearted person, but she felt like an idiot for ever doubting Bonbon would return. She'd always been there for her. She only wished she could have had the strength to wait a bit longer for her before giving up hope. She could remember clear as day the first time she'd ever been as upset as she was beforehand, and how Bonbon had been there to comfort her, and how she'd been the one to talk her out of making one of the worst decisions she could have ever considered. She couldn't do anything about her actions now, but she hated herself for making them without thinking of anything but her own selfish desires. She was dead for real this time now, and she'd left Lyra cradling her in her tears. She wanted to go back and make her pain end, but again she was faced with the fact that she was dead. She had no idea what would happen from this point on, but upon opening her eyes for a moment and finding that there was nothing but darkness around her, she came to terms with the fact that for her actions she may be forced to remain alone for the rest of time. She laid her head back down and cried some more. She didn't care how much she cried now. She had an eternity alone and no one to comfort her, and she thought nothing other than she deserved it. She thought back to the morning Bonbon had proved how much she cared about her, and wished a million times over in her mind that she could turn back time and be as strong before as she was for Bonbon back then. That night felt longer than any other to Bonbon. She hadn't slept at all while Lyra was crying. She'd only been able to lie awake and cuddle her, but managed to sleep for a short amount of time after Lyra had managed to fall asleep. She rolled over in Lyra's bed, but it wasn't until something snapped in her mind and she realised she was alone. Did she jump to life and look around for Lyra? She panicked a little and ran down the hall, looking quickly into the lounge room, but finding that it was the same as she'd left it. Lyra's mother remained peaceful under her blankets. She realised she hadn't told any pony about her being there yet, and made sure she'd get the message to the hospital soon. She backed out of the room and explored the other rooms in the house to find Lyra. "Lyra?" she called out. "Lyra!" she asked again, turning her head around the corners of a few rooms. Bonbon walked over around another and called out Lyra's name one more time before finding her in the kitchen, sitting facing the opposite direction. "Lyra, there you are!" she said, running over to her with a worried look on her face. She wasn't getting a response, but as soon as she got to her side, she jumped back horrified. Lyra was staring at the ground, tears pouring out of her eyes, and had a knife suspended in the air in front of her by her magic, twirling it around as if considering doing something with it. "Lyra, what are you doing?" Bonbon asked, horrified, attempting to run over and grab the knife away, only smacking into a force field Lyra had put up with her magic. Power that Bonbon didn't think she possessed in her magic at her age. "Lyra!" she yelled out, waiting for a response. "They're both gone, Bonbon. They're gone for good. They left me alone," Lyra finally replied, her voice hoarse and raspy. You aren't alone, Lyra. You've still got me, Bonbon told her, tears already starting to fill her eyes. And I love you for being here for me, Bonbon. You're the best friend I've ever had. But my parents are gone. What have I got to live for if I don't have them or a home to go to where I can feel safe and loved? Lyra asked, upset and apparently agitated. You can come live with me. My mother is always happy to have you around. Please, don't make any decision you'll regret. Your mum didn't leave you, Bonbon tried to tell her. Then what about my dad? He's gone. He left her alone to die by herself. He left me here too, as if he wanted me to suffer. He clearly didn't care about either of us. He couldn't even talk to me for the last 3 weeks, and now he's gone, without even a fucking goodbye, Laura screamed, her voice still raspy and her tears flowing harder. Bonbon started to cry even more, now afraid that if she didn't become convincing, her friend would kill herself. They'd both been through enough, and if she lost Lyra now, she would probably give up too. Lyra, what if he only went to the hospital to get help or went looking for you? She asked. Then why didn't he come back? He had the whole night. He would have come back at some point, she said, flicking the knife around in the air some more. Bonbon was starting to freak out. Lyra, your parents loved you. If your dad ran off because he couldn't handle not being with your mum, you shouldn't blame yourself. Bonbon tried to convince her. My mother hardly showed me any love. She said it, sure, but I could never see it, Lyra said, sighing as emotional distress was causing herself, was tearing deeper into her heart. That's not true. She loved you with all her heart. Wait here, please. Stay strong, Lyra. Bonbon begged, running off to fetch Symphony's note. Lyra sat in the kitchen crying her eyes out. She hated what she was putting Bonbon through and hated herself for blocking her away. She knew her best friend was only trying to help her because she cared about her, and she didn't want to put her through anything else. But she felt so weak. She wasn't sure if she'd be able to stop herself from doing stupid if she kept thinking about her parents and how much she thought they hated her. Bonbon was by no means fooling around as she sped to Lyra's room and grabbed the note. Before long, she was galloping back to the kitchen. Lyra, read this. I found it under your mother's pillow last night. I wanted to wait till you weren't so distraught to show you, but you need to see it. Your mother loved you very much, Bonbon cried, holding the note against the force field. Lyra looked up confused and dropped the knife from her concentration, letting it fall to the ground. Turning her attention to the note, she grabbed it in her magic and dropped the force field. Bonbon ran over to Lyra and wrapped her forelegs around her, reluctant to let her go. While Bonbon continued to cry, Lyra's eyes had reduced to watering momentarily as she read through the note. It didn't last long, though. As soon as Lyra had even passed the first few lines, she started to yet again break down into tears, and by the end of the note she was reduced to a bawling mess. Tears were streaming out of her eyes, and she finally believed that her mother did love her. She felt some happiness warm her heart, believing her mother may actually be with her in spirit at the very moment. She let the note fall to the floor and wrapped her forelegs around Bonbon, returning her embrace and crying onto her shoulder yet again. Thank you, Bonbon. I... Lyra didn't know what to say. She felt like her troubles were retreating and that she now had a reason to keep living. Don't worry about it, Bonbon replied, sniffling. It's what BFFs do, she said, kissing Lyra's forehead. That afternoon, the pair walked together to the hospital and informed Symphony's doctor of her passing before returning to Bonbon's home and arranging a room for Lyra. After explaining the tragedy to Lyra's own mother, with all the good now happening to Lyra after the heartbreak, she finally realised that people did care about her, and that she had a reason to make her mother proud, even if it was just to honour her memory.